The candles in the ballroom burned bright, but Alara Whitmore felt as cold as the marble floor beneath her feet. She stood near a tall window, holding a glass of untouched wine, when Lady Pembroke's voice cut through the music like a blade. "She is nothing more than a decorative ornament, not a prospect," Lady Pembroke said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Pretty to look at, perhaps, but no man of standing would ever consider her a wife." The words landed like a slap. Alara's fingers tightened around the glass stem. She did not turn. She did not cry. She simply stood there, her back straight, her chin lifted, refusing to give the woman the satisfaction of a reaction. Around her, conversations paused. A few young women exchanged smug glances. Others looked away, embarrassed on her behalf but unwilling to speak up. This was the way of the world she had been born into, but never truly belonged to. A world of silk gowns and sharp tongues, where a woman's worth was measured by her father's fortune and her mother's bloodline. Alara had neither in abundance. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, had once been a respected merchant, but a series of failed ventures had left the family with a title in name only, and debts that whispered behind closed doors. She had been brought to this ball not because anyone expected her to find a husband, but because her aunt had begged for an invitation, hoping proximity to wealth might somehow rub off on the family's fortunes. She had known, walking in, that she would be judged. She had not expected to be humiliated so publicly. "Ignore her," whispered a soft voice beside her. It was Beatrice Lyle, Alara's closest friend since childhood, the only person in the room who seemed to see her as more than her family's declining name. "Lady Pembroke says cruel things about everyone. It means nothing." "It means something to her," Alara murmured, forcing a small, tight smile. She wanted an audience, and she got one. Beatrice squeezed her hand gently, then let her have her show. "You do not have to stay for the second act." But before Alara could move, before she could slip quietly toward the door and disappear into the night air outside, something changed in the room. The orchestra faltered for half a beat. Voices dropped to murmurs. Alara felt it before she understood it, a shift in the air, the kind that happens when everyone in a room turns to look at the same thing at once. She turned her head slightly and saw him. Duke Alistair Ravenscroft was crossing the ballroom floor. He was not walking toward Lady Pembroke, who had straightened her posture the moment she noticed him moving, clearly expecting his attention as her due. He was not walking toward her daughter, Charlotte Pembroke, who stood nearby in a gown clearly chosen to catch a duke's eye. He was not walking toward any of the dozen young ladies who had spent the entire evening positioning themselves near the refreshment table, in the hope that he might wander close enough to notice them. He was walking toward her. Alara felt her heartbeat quicken, though she told herself firmly that there had to be some mistake. Perhaps he was heading toward the window behind her. Perhaps he wished to speak with someone standing just past her shoulder. She almost turned to look, certain the truth would reveal itself, and spare her from foolish hope. But the Duke stopped directly in front of her. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had imagined from a distance. He was tall, with dark hair combed back neatly, and eyes the color of storm clouds, gray, sharp, and unreadable. He wore his formal coat the way some men wore armor, as though it were both protection and weapon. Every young woman in the room had spoken of him at some point in the evening, in tones ranging from admiration to fear. He was known to be reserved, difficult to please, and utterly uninterested in the endless parade of women paraded before him by hopeful families. And yet here he stood, in front of her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice calm and even, though it carried easily across the sudden silence that had fallen around them. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" For a moment, Alara could not speak. She was aware of Lady Pembroke's face, frozen somewhere between shock and fury. She was aware of Charlotte Pembroke's mouth opening slightly, as though the air itself had been knocked from her lungs. She was aware of Beatrice beside her, gripping her arm with quiet excitement. But mostly, she was aware of him, of those gray eyes fixed on her, waiting patiently for her answer, as though the rest of the room did not exist at all. "Your Grace," she managed finally, dipping into a small curtsy. "I would be honored." He extended his hand. She placed hers in it, and the moment their fingers touched, she felt something she could not name. Not quite nervousness, not quite excitement, but something close to both. He led her onto the floor, as the orchestra began again, a little unevenly at first, as though the musicians themselves had been caught off guard. Ilara had danced at balls before, but never like this. Never with every eye in the room following her every step. Never with whispers rising and falling around her like waves. "You seem surprised," the Duke said quietly as they began to move through the steps of the dance. "I am," Ilara admitted. There seemed little point in pretending otherwise. "I did not expect to be asked to dance tonight, certainly not by you." "Because of what Lady Pembroke said?" Ilara's steps faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly. "You heard that." "The entire room heard it," he said, his tone carefully neutral, though something flickered behind his eyes, something that might have been anger, carefully controlled. "She spoke loudly enough to be heard from the gardens." Heat rose in Ilara's cheeks. "Then you must understand why I find this dance somewhat confusing, Your Grace. A decorative ornament is not typically invited onto the floor by a duke." "Perhaps," he said. "I disagree with Lady Pembroke's assessment." "Or perhaps," Ilara replied, unable to stop the words before they left her mouth, "you simply enjoy causing a stir." For the briefest moment, something shifted in his expression, the corner of his mouth lifting, not quite a smile, but close to one. "You are direct, Miss Whitmore. Forgive me, I did not mean to overstep." "No," he said. "Do not apologize for it. I find it rather refreshing, after an evening of careful compliments and rehearsed conversation." They continued through the dance in silence for a moment, the music swelling around them, the eyes of the room still fixed upon them both. Ilara could see Lady Pembroke standing rigid near the refreshment table, her fan snapping shut with a sharp sound, her expression carved from stone. Charlotte stood beside her mother, arms crossed, watching the dance with an expression that suggested she was doing complicated arithmetic in her head, trying to calculate exactly how this had happened, and how it might be undone. "They are all watching us," Ilara said quietly. "They are always watching," the Duke replied. "It is the nature of rooms like this one. Every glance, every word, every dance becomes a piece of gossip before the night is through. Does that not bother you?" "It used to," he said, and something in his voice suggested there was more to that answer than he was willing to share in the middle of a crowded ballroom. "I have learned to accept it as the cost of my position." The dance drew to its natural close, the final notes fading into applause and murmured conversation. The Duke did not release her hand immediately. Instead, he held it a moment longer than propriety strictly required, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles, in a gesture so small that only she would have noticed it. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Thank you, Your Grace, for the honor," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He bowed slightly and stepped back, and for a moment, Ilara thought that would be the end of it. A single dance, a single kindness, perhaps offered simply to embarrass Lady Pembroke, rather than out of any genuine interest in her. Dukes did not court merchants' daughters with fading fortunes. Everyone knew that. It was one of the unspoken rules of this world, as fixed and unbending as the positions of the stars. But as he turned to walk away, he paused and looked back at her. "I hope," he said, "that we might speak again before the evening ends." Then he was gone, swallowed back into the crowd of guests, eager for his attention, leaving Ilara standing alone on the dance floor, with her heart pounding and every eye in the room fixed upon her. Beatrice appeared at her side almost instantly, practically vibrating with excitement. "Ilara, Ilara, do you understand what just happened?" "I am not entirely certain I do," Ilara admitted, still watching the space where the Duke had disappeared. "The Duke of Ravenscroft," Beatrice whispered, gripping her arm, "who has refused every eligible young woman brought before him for the past 3 years, who has been the subject of endless matchmaking schemes by half the mothers in this city, walked across an entire ballroom to ask you to dance. After Lady Pembroke insulted you in front of everyone." "I am aware," Ilara said, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. "Do you think he did it on purpose, to embarrass her?" It was a fair question, and one Ilara had already asked herself. Perhaps the Duke had simply wanted to make a public statement, to remind Lady Pembroke and the rest of the room that his choices were his own, unbound by the opinions of society matrons. Perhaps she had simply been a convenient tool for that purpose, the nearest available woman to prove a point. But there had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, something that felt less like calculation and more like genuine curiosity. And there had been that small pause before he walked away, that quiet request that they might speak again. "I do not know," Elara said honestly, "but I suspect we are all about to find out." Across the room, Lady Pembroke had gathered a small cluster of women around her, her voice low but sharp, clearly already constructing a narrative that would explain away what had just happened in a manner more flattering to herself. Charlotte stood beside her mother, her earlier shock replaced by something colder, more calculating. Elara did not need to hear the words to know what was being said. She had lived long enough in this world to understand its currents, the way stories could be reshaped and reframed, before the truth even had a chance to settle. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, standing in the middle of a ballroom full of judgment and gossip, Elara did not feel invisible. She did not feel like an ornament, meant only to be seen and never truly considered. She felt, for the first time in a long while, like she mattered. Whatever the Duke's reasons had been, whatever came next, she would not let this moment slip away without understanding it fully. She had spent her whole life being underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. Tonight, something had shifted, however slightly, and Elara intended to find out exactly what it meant. As the orchestra began a new song, and the room slowly returned to its usual rhythm of chatter and dance, Elara caught one more glimpse of the Duke across the room. He was speaking with an older gentleman, nodding along to whatever was being said, but his eyes found hers for just a moment before returning to the conversation. It was brief, it was subtle, but it was enough to tell her that whatever had happened between them on that dance floor had not been imagined, and it had not been finished. The night, Elara realized with a mixture of anticipation and quiet unease, was only just beginning. The morning after the ball, Elara sat by the window of her small family home, watching the rain trace slow paths down the glass. Sleep had not come easily the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Duke crossing that ballroom floor, felt his hand closing around hers, heard his quiet voice asking if they might speak again. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not marry merchants' daughters, especially not merchants' daughters whose fathers owed money to half the city. But she could not shake the memory of his eyes, steady and searching, as though he had truly been looking at her and not simply performing a courtesy for the sake of appearances. "You are somewhere else entirely," her mother, Clara Whitmore, said from across the small parlor, where she sat mending a torn hem with careful, practiced stitches. "I have asked you twice whether you would like tea." "Forgive me," Elara said, turning from the window. "I did not hear you." "I noticed." Clara set down her needle and studied her daughter with the sharp, knowing look that mothers seem to possess in abundance. "Something happened at the ball last night. Beatrice's mother called this morning, while you were still asleep. She could speak of nothing else." Elara felt her cheeks warm. "It was only a dance." "A dance with the Duke of Ravenscroft is never only a dance, Elara. Not for a family in our position." Clara's voice carried no malice, only a tired kind of realism that came from years of watching doors close in their faces. "People will talk. They already are talking, from what I understand." "Let them talk," Elara said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt a flicker of unease at what those conversations might contain. "I have done nothing wrong." "No," her mother agreed gently, "but that has rarely stopped people from finding fault with you regardless." The words settled uncomfortably in Elara's chest, because she knew them to be true. She had spent her entire life carefully, quietly, trying not to draw attention, trying to exist in the margins of a society that had already decided what she was worth before she ever opened her mouth. Last night, for one dance, she had stood in the center of that world instead of its edges, and she was not entirely certain what to do with the sudden weight of so many eyes upon her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Their aging housekeeper, Nora, appeared a moment later, her expression somewhere between excitement and confusion. "There is a letter for you, Miss Elara," Nora said, holding out a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. "It came by private messenger. The seal—" She hesitated, clearly recognizing its significance. "The seal belongs to the House of Ravenscroft." Elara's hands trembled slightly as she took the envelope. Her mother set down her needle entirely now, watching with unconcealed interest as Elara broke the seal and unfolded the letter within. The handwriting was neat, controlled, betraying none of the reserve she had witnessed in the Duke's manner the previous evening. Miss Whitmore, I hope this letter finds you well after last evening's festivities. I confess I have thought a great deal about our conversation, brief as it was, and I find myself wishing to continue it under less crowded circumstances. If it would not trouble you, I would be honored if you and a suitable companion might join me for tea in the gardens of Ravenscroft House this coming Thursday afternoon. I understand this request may seem unusual, given the circumstances of our introduction, and I do not wish to cause you any discomfort or unwanted attention. If you would prefer to decline, I will understand completely and will not trouble you further. With sincere regard, Alistair Ravenscroft. Ilara read the letter twice, then a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more sensible upon further inspection. But they remained exactly as they were, an invitation, direct and unmistakable, from a duke who had no reason at all to seek out her company. Well? Clara asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. What does it say? Wordlessly, Ilara handed the letter to her mother, who read it with visibly widening eyes. He is inviting you to Ravenscroft House, Clara said slowly, as though testing whether the words made more sense spoken aloud, for tea, in the gardens. With a suitable companion, Ilara added. He is being careful, proper. He is being interested, Clara corrected, a note of cautious hope entering her voice, for the first time, in longer than Ilara could remember. Ilara, do you understand what this could mean, if it is genuine? I understand what people will say if it is not, Ilara replied quietly. I understand what Lady Pembroke will say regardless. Her mother's expression softened. You have spent so long protecting yourself from disappointment that you have forgotten how to hope for anything good, my dear. I do not blame you for it. Life has given you little reason to hope. But perhaps this is different. Ilara looked down at the letter again, at the careful, deliberate handwriting, at the honest uncertainty woven through the Duke's words. He had given her an easy way to decline, had made clear he would not press the matter if she wished to walk away. There had been no arrogance in the invitation, no assumption that she would simply be grateful for his attention. It had been, in its own quiet way, respectful. I will need Beatrice to accompany me, Ilara said finally, folding the letter carefully. If I am to go at all. Then you have decided, Clara said, a small smile touching her lips. I have decided to be curious, Ilara corrected. Nothing more than that. Not yet. But even as she spoke the words, she felt the same flutter of anticipation that had gripped her the night before, standing on the dance floor, with his hand in hers. Whatever this was, curiosity, kindness, or something else entirely, she found she did not want to walk away from it without understanding it fully. By the time Thursday arrived, word of the Duke's dance with Ilara had spread through every corner of society that mattered. Beatrice arrived at the Whitmore home that morning practically breathless with news. You would not believe the things being said, she announced, settling into a chair in the parlor, while Ilara finished dressing for the visit. Lady Pembroke has been telling everyone that the Duke only danced with you to spite her, because she once refused to introduce him to some distant cousin of hers years ago. Others are saying he did it out of pity, because of what she said about you. And a few. Beatrice paused, clearly debating whether to continue. A few? Ilara prompted, adjusting the pale blue ribbon in her hair. A few are saying he genuinely admired you, and that Lady Pembroke's cruelty simply gave him the opportunity to show it, Beatrice said. For what it is worth, I believe that version most of all. Ilara said nothing, though her heart quickened slightly at the thought. You are going to Ravenscroft House, Beatrice continued, standing to help smooth the folds of Ilara's dress. As my dearest friend, I feel I must ask directly, are you frightened? Terrified, Ilara admitted with a small, nervous laugh, but also curious. I do not know which feeling is stronger. Perhaps they can exist together, Beatrice said gently. Fear and curiosity have walked hand in hand through every great story ever told. The carriage ride to Ravenscroft House felt longer than it likely was, the city streets giving way gradually to wider roads lined with tall, elegant townhouses, and finally, to the grand iron gates that marked the entrance to the Duke's estate. Ilara had passed by these gates 100 times in her life, without ever imagining she might one day pass through them as an invited guest. The gardens, when they arrived, were even more beautiful than she had imagined. Neatly trimmed hedges lined winding stone paths, and rows of blooming flowers in every shade of pink and gold stretched toward a distant fountain that caught the afternoon light in glittering droplets. A small table had been set beneath a canopy of climbing roses, laid with delicate china, and a modest but elegant spread of tea and pastries. The Duke rose from his seat as they approached, and Alara noted, with some surprise, that he looked almost nervous himself, a stark contrast to the composed, unreadable figure she had danced with 3 nights before. "Miss Whitmore. Miss Lyle." He bowed slightly to each of them in turn. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. I was not entirely certain you would." "You made it difficult to refuse, Your Grace," Alara said, taking the seat he offered. "A garden this lovely is a persuasive argument on its own." Something in his expression eased slightly, a shadow of genuine amusement crossing his features. "I cannot take credit for the garden. That belongs entirely to my late mother's design, and my gardener's continued efforts to honor it." They settled into conversation slowly at first, careful and polite, discussing safe topics: the weather, the recent ball, the various families in attendance. Beatrice, ever perceptive, gradually allowed the conversation to flow more naturally between Alara and the Duke, offering the occasional comment but largely stepping back to observe. As the afternoon wore on, Alara found herself relaxing in ways she had not expected. The Duke, away from the crowded, judgmental eyes of the ballroom, seemed an entirely different man, thoughtful, curious, willing to laugh at himself in ways she had not anticipated from someone of his reputation. "May I ask you something direct?" Alara said finally, emboldened by the ease that had settled between them. "Why did you truly ask me to dance that night? I would rather know the truth than continue guessing." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, turning his teacup slowly in his hands. "Because Lady Pembroke's words angered me," he admitted finally. "Not simply because they were cruel, though they were, but because I recognized something in the way you stood there, refusing to let her cruelty break your composure. I have spent my entire life being told what I am worth, based on my title and my fortune, rarely for who I actually am. I saw the same thing happening to you, in reverse, and I found I could not simply stand by and watch it happen." Alara felt her chest tighten with an emotion she could not immediately name. "That is a more honest answer than I expected, Your Grace." "I find," he said quietly, "that honesty comes more easily to me in gardens than in ballrooms." For the first time since the letter had arrived, Alara allowed herself to believe, however cautiously, that this might be something real after all. Word travels quickly in a city built on gossip, and by the following week, the tea in the gardens of Ravenscroft House had become the most discussed event in every fashionable drawing room. Alara had known this would happen, had braced herself for it, but the reality still felt overwhelming when she stepped out of her front door and found 2 women she barely knew, watching her from across the street with undisguised curiosity. "They look at me as though I have grown a second head," Alara said to Beatrice as they walked through the market square that afternoon, baskets in hand for the day's errands. "You have become interesting," Beatrice replied simply. "For years, no one looked at you at all. Now everyone wishes to know everything about you. It must feel strange." "It feels uncomfortable," Alara admitted. "I did nothing to earn this attention beyond drinking tea in a garden." "You earned it the moment the Duke chose you over every other woman in that ballroom," Beatrice said. "Whether you wanted the attention or not, it has arrived, and now you must decide how to carry it." Alara considered this as they moved between market stalls, the scent of fresh bread and flowers mixing in the warm afternoon air. She had spent her whole life trying to remain unnoticed, understanding instinctively that visibility, for a woman in her position, often brought more danger than reward. Now, quite suddenly, she found herself the subject of speculation in every corner of society, and she was not entirely certain how to navigate this unfamiliar territory. It was as they passed a small flower stall that Alara first noticed Charlotte Pembroke standing nearby, apparently examining a bundle of white roses with far more attention than the flowers warranted. Charlotte looked up as they approached, and for a moment, something passed between the 2 young women. Not quite hostility, but something close to careful assessment. "Miss Whitmore," Charlotte said, her voice pleasant enough on the surface. though Elara had learned enough about her family to recognize the sharpness hidden beneath. "How fortunate to see you. I understand you have been spending a great deal of time at Ravenscroft House lately." "Only once, Miss Pembroke," Elara replied carefully. "For tea." "Of course, tea." Charlotte's smile did not reach her eyes. "How lovely. My mother mentioned that the Duke has always had a particular fondness for charitable gestures. Perhaps that explains his sudden interest in your company." Elara felt Beatrice stiffen beside her, ready to respond sharply, but Elara placed a gentle hand on her friend's arm, silently asking her to let the comment pass. "Perhaps," Elara said evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. "Though I confess I have not asked him to explain his own intentions to me in such detail. I find it is generally wiser to let a person's actions speak for themselves, rather than assuming motives I cannot truly know." Something flickered across Charlotte's face, surprise perhaps, at the calm firmness of the response. She had clearly expected either embarrassment or defensive anger, and Elara's measured reply seemed to leave her momentarily uncertain how to proceed. "Well," Charlotte said finally, recovering her composure, "I do hope, for your sake, that his interest proves genuine, rather than fleeting. It would be a shame to build hopes upon something so uncertain." "Thank you for your concern," Elara said politely, though both women understood the words carried no true warmth. "Good afternoon, Miss Pembroke." As they walked away, Beatrice let out a long breath. "I do not know how you managed to remain so composed. I wanted to throw those roses directly at her." "Anger would only give her satisfaction," Elara said, though her heart was beating faster than she cared to admit. "She wants to see me rattled. I would rather disappoint her." But despite her outward calm, Charlotte's words lingered in Elara's mind for the rest of the day, planting small seeds of doubt she had not entirely managed to banish. What if the Duke's interest was, in fact, a passing curiosity, soon to fade once the novelty wore off? What if she allowed herself to hope, only to be discarded once society's attention moved on to some other subject of interest? That evening, as Elara sat in the small parlor of her family home reading by candlelight, another letter arrived, again bearing the familiar blue wax seal of Ravenscroft House. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "Miss Whitmore, I find myself thinking often of our conversation in the garden, and I confess, I would very much like to continue it. There is a concert this Saturday evening at the Ashworth estate, hosted by my good friend Lord Gregory Ashford. I would be honored if you would allow me to escort you, along with any companion you feel appropriate. I understand that accepting such an invitation carries certain risks to your reputation, given the attention our previous meeting has already generated. I do not ask you to accept lightly, and I will respect whatever decision you reach. With continued regard, Alistair Ravenscroft." Elara read the letter twice, feeling the familiar swirl of excitement and apprehension settle in her chest. A concert, hosted publicly, with the Duke as her escort, would remove any doubt about the nature of his intentions. It would also expose her to a level of scrutiny far beyond anything she had yet experienced. She thought of Charlotte's carefully worded warning, of Lady Pembroke's cruel dismissal at the ball, of the countless whispered conversations she imagined happening across the city at this very moment. She thought, too, of the Duke's honest admission in the garden, of the quiet sincerity in his voice when he spoke of understanding what it felt like to be reduced to nothing more than a title or a fortune. The following morning, she sought out her father in his small study, where he sat surrounded by ledgers and unpaid bills, his expression weary in the way it had become increasingly common over recent months. "Father," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I have received another invitation from the Duke of Ravenscroft." Edmund Whitmore looked up, surprise evident on his tired features. "Another one? So soon?" "A concert, this Saturday. He wishes to escort me publicly." Her father set down his pen slowly, studying her, with an expression she found difficult to read. "Elara, I must ask you plainly, do you believe his intentions are genuine? Or do you fear, as I confess I sometimes do, that this may be some passing fascination that will fade as quickly as it arrived, leaving you exposed to ridicule once it does?" It was a fair question, and one Elara had asked herself countless times since the ball. "I do not know for certain," she admitted. "But I believe he is being honest with me, as much as he can be, and I find that I do not wish to refuse, simply out of fear of what might happen if I am wrong." Her father was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for something. Perhaps reassurance, perhaps simply understanding. "Your mother and I have not always been able to offer you the protections other families might provide," he said finally, his voice heavy with a guilt Elara had witnessed many times before. "I am sorry for that. But if this is truly what you wish, then you have my blessing to accept." "Thank you, Father," Elara said softly, reaching across the desk to take his hand. "Just be careful, my dear," he added. "The world we live in can be unkind to those who reach beyond their expected place, regardless of how deserving they may be." Elara nodded, understanding the warning fully, even as her heart continued to beat with a hope she found increasingly difficult to suppress. Whatever risks lay ahead, whatever whispers and warnings continued to swirl around her, she had made her decision. She would attend the concert, she would stand beside the Duke, publicly and without apology, and she would face whatever consequences followed, with the same quiet composure that had carried her through every difficult moment of her life thus far. The following days passed in a blur of preparation, Beatrice helping her select and adjust a modest but elegant gown for the occasion, while Elara's mother fretted over details of propriety and appearance, with an anxious energy that betrayed her own hopes for how the evening might unfold. By Saturday evening, as the carriage arrived to carry her to the Ashworth estate, Elara felt a calm settle over her that surprised even herself. Whatever happened tonight, she had chosen this path with open eyes, understanding both its risks and its possibilities. She would not shrink from it now. As the carriage rolled through the city streets toward the concert, Elara looked out at the passing lights and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was stepping toward something rather than simply enduring what life had handed her. Whatever awaited at the Ashworth estate, she intended to meet it standing tall. The Ashworth estate glowed with lantern light as carriages lined the long gravel drive, guests spilling out in waves of silk and polished shoes. Elara stepped down from her family's modest carriage, with Beatrice at her side, both of them pausing for a moment to take in the grandeur of the house before them. "There is no turning back now," Beatrice murmured, squeezing Elara's hand once for reassurance. "I was never planning to turn back," Elara replied, though her pulse quickened as she noticed several heads already turning in her direction. They had barely stepped inside the grand entrance hall when a familiar figure approached, Lord Gregory Ashford himself, the host of the evening and, as Elara had learned, one of the Duke's closest and most trusted friends. He was a tall man with an easy smile and warm eyes, entirely unlike the cautious formality she had expected from someone in the Duke's inner circle. "Miss Whitmore," Lord Ashford said, bowing slightly. "Alistair has spoken of you rather often this past week. I confess I was curious to meet the woman who has occupied so much of his attention." "I hope he has said nothing to embarrass either of us, my lord," Elara replied, managing a small smile despite her nerves. "Quite the opposite," Ashford said, his expression warming further. "He seems more himself lately than I have seen him in years. That alone speaks well of your influence." Before Elara could respond, she felt a familiar presence approaching, and turned to find the Duke himself crossing the hall toward her, dressed in dark formal attire that seemed to sharpen the intensity of his gray eyes. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying a warmth she had not heard in public before. "I am glad you came." "You left me little choice, Your Grace," Elara replied. "A concert is difficult to resist." "I hope the invitation itself might prove more persuasive than the concert," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than strictly proper. Ashford, watching this exchange with obvious amusement, cleared his throat gently. "I shall leave you both to your conversation. The concert begins shortly, and I have other guests requiring my attention." As Ashford moved away, the Duke offered his arm, and Elara took it, allowing him to guide her toward the music room, where rows of chairs had been arranged before a small orchestra, preparing their instruments. She was acutely aware of the eyes following their progress, of the whispered conversations rippling through the crowd like wind through tall grass. "You seem unbothered by the attention," Elara observed quietly, as they took their seats. "I have had a great deal of practice ignoring it," the Duke replied. "Though I confess it feels different tonight, knowing you are the subject of so much curiosity alongside me. Does that trouble you?" "No," he said simply. "It troubles me only that it might cause you discomfort. I would not wish for my choices to bring you harm. Alara considered his words carefully, searching his expression for any sign of insincerity, but found none. I appreciate your concern, Your Grace, though I have grown somewhat accustomed to discomfort over the years. It is, perhaps, the one skill my circumstances have taught me well. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something that looked almost like sadness. I wish that were not the case. Before Alara could respond, the orchestra began to play, and conversation gave way to the swelling notes of a piece she did not recognize, but found immediately beautiful. She allowed herself, for a few precious minutes, to simply exist in the music, aware of the Duke beside her, but not required to speak. Not required to defend herself, or explain her presence to anyone. During the interval between pieces, as guests began to mingle, and refreshments were served, Alara noticed Lady Pembroke entering the room, resplendent in deep burgundy silk, her sharp eyes sweeping the crowd until they landed unmistakably on Alara and the Duke seated together. "Here we are," Alara murmured, watching Lady Pembroke's expression shift from surprise to something colder, more calculating. The Duke followed her gaze and sighed quietly. "I had hoped we might enjoy at least one evening without her interference." "I do not think Lady Pembroke is capable of allowing an evening to pass without some form of interference," Alara said, a note of dry humor entering her voice despite her nerves. Lady Pembroke approached with practiced grace, her smile polite, but her eyes sharp as knives. "Your Grace, Miss Whitmore, how lovely to see you both here together, again." "Lady Pembroke," the Duke replied evenly, his tone giving away nothing of his private feelings on the matter. "I trust you are enjoying the concert." "Immensely," Lady Pembroke said, though her attention remained fixed on Alara. "I must say, Miss Whitmore, you seem to be enjoying quite the elevated social calendar of late. Tea at Ravenscroft House, and now a private concert at the Ashworth estate. Quite the transformation for someone so recently described as," she paused deliberately, "decorative." The barb landed precisely as intended, and Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced herself to remain composed. Before she could respond, however, the Duke spoke, his voice carrying a firmness that silenced the surrounding chatter. "I believe, Lady Pembroke, that Miss Whitmore has proven herself considerably more than decorative in every conversation we have shared. Perhaps it would serve you well to reconsider your earlier assessment, given how thoroughly it has been disproven." Lady Pembroke's smile faltered slightly, clearly not having anticipated such a direct rebuke. "I meant no offense, Your Grace, merely an observation." "Then allow me to offer one in return," the Duke continued, his tone still perfectly polite, but unmistakably firm. "A woman's worth is rarely determined by the volume with which others choose to discuss her shortcomings. I would hope, in the future, that such observations might be kept private, rather than shared for the entertainment of a crowded room." For a moment, Lady Pembroke seemed genuinely at a loss for words, her composure cracking just slightly, before she recovered enough to offer a stiff nod and excuse herself from the conversation entirely, retreating toward a group of women near the refreshment table. Alara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "You did not need to defend me so publicly." "I disagree," the Duke said quietly. "I have watched too many people in this city speak cruelly of others, simply because those others lack the standing to respond in kind. I will not stand silently by while it happens in front of me, regardless of the cost to my own reputation." "And what will it cost you?" Alara asked, "defending me so openly against a woman with Lady Pembroke's influence?" The Duke considered the question seriously before answering. "Perhaps some inconvenience, perhaps some additional gossip, but I find I care considerably less about such things than I once did." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "I find, Miss Whitmore, that I care a great deal more about you." The words hung in the air between them, quiet but unmistakable, and Alara felt something shift deep within her chest, a warmth, a hope, that she had spent years teaching herself not to feel. "Your Grace," she began softly, uncertain how to respond to such an open admission. "Alistair," he said gently, "if we are to continue speaking honestly with one another, I would prefer you use my given name, at least when we are not required to observe formality for the benefit of others." "Alistair," Alara repeated, testing the name, feeling its unfamiliar weight in her mouth. "Then you must call me Alara." He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his features entirely, softening the reserved composure he wore so carefully in public settings. "Alara," he said, as though testing the sound of it himself. The concert resumed shortly after, and though the music continued to swell beautifully around them, Alara found her attention remained fixed less on the orchestra and more on the man seated beside her, whose honesty and quiet defense of her dignity had begun to dismantle every careful wall she had built around her heart. As the evening drew to its close, and guests began departing into the cool night air, the Duke walked Alara and Beatrice to their waiting carriage, his hand lingering briefly at the small of her back as he assisted her inside. "Thank you for this evening, Alistair," Alara said through the carriage window. "Thank you for allowing me the honor of your company," he replied. "I hope this will not be our last." As the carriage pulled away, Alara watched him standing in the lantern light, tall and composed, until the estate disappeared behind the bend of the road. She turned to find Beatrice watching her with unrestrained delight. "I believe," Beatrice said, "that this may be the beginning of something truly remarkable." Alara said nothing, but the small, hopeful smile that touched her lips spoke clearly enough of her own growing belief in the very same thing. News of the Duke's public defense of Alara at the Ashworth concert spread through the city faster than any rumor before it. By Monday morning, it seemed every household of consequence had heard some version of the exchange, each retelling growing slightly more dramatic than the last. Some claimed the Duke had nearly quarreled with Lady Pembroke outright. Others insisted he had declared his intentions toward Alara in front of the entire gathering. The truth, as always, had become tangled with exaggeration until it was difficult to separate fact from fiction. At Ravenscroft House, the reaction within the family itself proved far more measured, though no less significant. Duchess Margaret, the Duke's aunt and closest living relative since his parents had passed some years before, requested his presence in her private sitting room the morning after the concert, her expression carefully neutral as he entered. "Sit, Alistair," she said, gesturing toward a chair near her own. "I believe we have matters to discuss." "I assume you have heard about last evening," Alistair said, settling into the offered seat with the resigned patience of a man who had anticipated this conversation. "I have heard several versions," Margaret replied dryly. "Which, of course, tells me very little about what actually occurred. Perhaps you might enlighten me directly, rather than leaving me to sift through second-hand gossip." Alistair recounted the evening plainly. The concert, Lady Pembroke's pointed remarks, his own response in Alara's defense. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression revealing little until he finished speaking. "You understand," she said finally, "that defending a young woman so publicly, particularly one whose family carries the reputation the Whitmores currently do, will invite considerable scrutiny. Not simply of her, but of you." "I am aware," Alistair said. "I do not regret my actions." "I did not suggest you should," Margaret replied, a note of something like approval entering her voice. "I am simply ensuring you understand the consequences of the path you appear to be walking. Your father built this family's standing through careful, strategic alliances. Many will expect you to do the same. My father's alliances brought him very little happiness, from what I remember of him," Alistair said quietly. "I have watched enough marriages built purely on strategy to know I have no wish to follow that same path." Margaret studied her nephew for a long moment, something softening in her expression. "You truly care for this young woman?" It was not a question, but Alistair answered as though it had been. "I do, more than I expected to, given how briefly we have known one another." "And what of her circumstances, her family's debts, their diminished standing? Have you considered how such matters might complicate things, should your feelings continue to grow?" "I have considered them," Alistair admitted. "I find they trouble me far less than they perhaps should. Ilara's worth has never depended on her family's fortune, any more than mine has depended solely on my title." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying the fire crackling in the hearth before finally speaking again. "Your uncle, before his passing, once told me that the measure of a man is found not in the alliances he makes for advantage, but in the ones he makes for love, despite the difficulties such choices may bring. I did not fully understand his meaning until many years later." She turned back to face him. "If this young woman has earned your genuine regard, Alistair, Then I will not stand in your way. But I would ask that you proceed carefully, for both your sakes. The world we live in can be unkind to those who defy its expectations, regardless of how just those defiances may be. I understand, Alistair said, relief evident in his voice. Thank you, Aunt Margaret. Do not thank me yet, she replied, though a small smile had begun to form at the corner of her mouth. I have not yet met this young woman properly. Perhaps you might arrange an introduction, before society entirely decides the narrative of your courtship without either of our input. Alistair smiled. I believe that can be arranged. Meanwhile, across the city, Alara found herself facing scrutiny of her own kind. Her father's small shop, already struggling under the weight of accumulated debts, had begun receiving unusual attention. Customers who had never before shown interest suddenly appearing, ostensibly to purchase goods, but clearly more curious about the family whose daughter had captured a duke's public defense. It is strange, Edmund Whitmore remarked over dinner one evening, to find our little shop suddenly fashionable, simply because of gossip regarding your evening at a concert. I am sorry, Father, Alara said, guilt weighing on her despite herself. I did not intend to bring such attention upon the family. Do not apologize, her father said firmly. If anything, this attention has proven useful. Several new customers have placed genuine orders this week alone. Whatever else comes of this situation, it seems your connection to the Duke has, at the very least, brought some relief to our finances. I would not wish for that to be the reason anyone views this connection favorably, Alara said, uncomfortable with the implication that her relationship with Alistair might be reduced to its practical benefits for her family. No one is suggesting that, her mother interjected gently. But there is no shame in acknowledging that good things, even unexpected ones, can arrive alongside genuine affection. Both things can be true simultaneously. Alara considered this as she finished her meal, her thoughts drifting to the quiet honesty Alistair had shown her at the concert, the warmth in his voice when he had asked her to call him by his given name. Whatever practical benefits might arise from their connection, she found herself caring far more about the way he made her feel seen, truly seen, for perhaps the first time in her adult life. 2 days later, another letter arrived from Ravenscroft House, though this one carried a different request entirely. Alara, my aunt, Duchess Margaret, has expressed a wish to meet you properly, away from the noise and speculation of public gatherings. Would you do me the honor of joining us for a quiet dinner at Ravenscroft House this Friday evening? I understand this represents a significant step, and I do not make this request lightly. Please know that whatever her initial impressions, my own feelings toward you remain unchanged and unwavering. With continued affection, Alistair. Alara read the letter with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Meeting the Duchess felt like an entirely different challenge from attending a public concert or sharing tea in a garden. This was an invitation into the private heart of his family, a test of sorts, one she desperately hoped to pass. The Duchess wishes to meet you, Beatrice said, reading the letter over Alara's shoulder with evident excitement. Alara, this is significant. Families do not typically arrange such meetings, unless intentions are becoming quite serious. I am aware, Alara said, feeling the weight of the moment settle heavily upon her. I only hope I do not disappoint her. You have never disappointed anyone who took the time to truly know you, Beatrice said firmly. The Duchess would be a fool to feel otherwise, once she has spent an evening in your company. Despite her friend's reassurance, Alara spent the following days in a state of nervous anticipation, rehearsing conversations in her mind, considering every possible question the Duchess might ask, every impression she hoped to create. She understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that this dinner represented a crucial turning point, an opportunity to prove that Lady Pembroke's cruel assessment of her had been entirely, definitively wrong. When Friday evening finally arrived, Alara stood before her mirror, smoothing the folds of her modest but carefully chosen gown, taking a final steadying breath before descending to the waiting carriage. Whatever awaited her at Ravenscroft House, she intended to meet it with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every difficult moment thus far. The carriage ride felt shorter than she expected, her nerves compressing time in strange ways, and before she fully felt prepared, she found herself once again passing through the grand iron gates of the Duke's estate, this time as an invited guest, to a far more intimate and significant gathering than any before it. The dining room at Ravenscroft House was smaller than Alara had expected, warm and intimate rather than grand and imposing, with soft candlelight casting gentle shadows across polished wood and fine silver settings. Duchess Margaret sat at the head of the table when Alara and Alistair entered, her posture perfectly upright, her sharp eyes assessing Alara with an intensity that made her feel as though every detail of her appearance and manner was being carefully catalogued. "Miss Whitmore," the Duchess said, her voice cool, but not unkind. "Please, sit. I have heard a great deal about you these past weeks, though I confess, I prefer forming my own impressions, rather than relying on the accounts of others." "Thank you for the invitation, Your Grace," Alara said, taking the offered seat with as much composure as she could muster. "I hope I might prove worthy of your consideration." "We shall see," Margaret replied, though something in her tone suggested she was not entirely unkind in her skepticism, merely cautious. Dinner began with polite, careful conversation, the Duchess asking measured questions about Alara's family, her upbringing, her interests. Each answer weighed and considered before the next question followed. Alistair remained mostly quiet during these initial exchanges, watching with evident tension, though he occasionally offered a reassuring glance across the table. "Your father was once a respected merchant, I understand," Margaret said, cutting into her meal with precise, deliberate movements, before certain difficulties arose. "Yes, Your Grace," Alara said, refusing to let embarrassment creep into her voice. "My father built his business through honest labor and fair dealing. Unfortunate circumstances beyond his control led to some of our recent difficulties, but I remain proud of the values he instilled in our family, regardless of our current fortune." "And what values might those be?" Margaret asked, her sharp eyes never leaving Alara's face. "Honesty," Alara replied without hesitation. "Kindness toward those less fortunate, even when we ourselves have little to spare. And the belief that a person's worth is measured by their character, not simply by the size of their purse." Something shifted in Margaret's expression, a flicker of genuine interest replacing her earlier careful scrutiny. "Those are admirable values, Miss Whitmore. Rare ones, I find, particularly among those who move through the circles my nephew and I inhabit. I have found," Alara continued, emboldened by the shift in tone, "that wealth often makes people careless with kindness, believing they have little need of it. Poverty, on the other hand, teaches you rather quickly how essential kindness becomes, both in giving it and receiving it." Margaret set down her fork, studying Alara with renewed attention. "Alistair tells me you showed remarkable composure at the ball, despite Lady Pembroke's cruel remarks. Tell me honestly, Miss Whitmore, did her words truly not wound you, or did you simply hide the wound skillfully?" Alara considered the question carefully before answering, recognizing that honesty, not performance, would serve her best in this moment. "Her words wounded me deeply, Your Grace. I have spent my entire life being reminded, in various ways, that society considers me lesser for my family's circumstances. But I learned long ago that showing such wounds only invites further cruelty, so I have taught myself to carry them quietly, rather than displaying them for others to exploit." The honesty in her answer seemed to affect the Duchess more than any careful diplomatic response might have. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing, simply studying Alara with an expression that had softened considerably from its earlier guarded caution. "You remind me, in some ways, of myself at your age," Margaret said finally, her voice quieter now. "I too came from circumstances considered beneath this family's standing when I first married into it. I know what it means to be underestimated, to be viewed as unworthy of the position you find yourself unexpectedly occupying." "I did not know that, Your Grace," Alara said softly, genuinely surprised. "Few do," Margaret replied. "It is not a history I share freely, but I tell you now, because I wish you to understand, that I do not judge you for your family's circumstances. I judge you, instead, on your character, and thus far, Miss Whitmore, I find myself rather impressed." Relief flooded through Alara, though she maintained her composure, offering a grateful smile in response. Across the table, Alistair's shoulders visibly relaxed, the tension he had carried throughout dinner finally easing. "Thank you, Your Grace," Alara said. "Your words mean a great deal to me." "Do not thank me yet," Margaret said, though her tone now carried genuine warmth rather than earlier caution. Approval from an old woman is easily given. The true test will come from society at large, which rarely extends the same grace I have just offered you. Are you prepared for that battle, Miss Whitmore? I have been fighting it my entire life, Your Grace, Ilara replied steadily. I do not intend to stop now. As dinner continued, conversation grew easier, more relaxed, the careful formality of earlier exchanges giving way to genuine warmth. Margaret shared stories of Alistair's childhood, much to his visible embarrassment, recounting tales of a young boy who had once refused to attend a formal gathering because he preferred spending the afternoon exploring the estate's gardens with his tutor instead. He has always possessed a stubborn independence, Margaret said fondly, regardless of what society expected of him. I suspect that same quality is precisely why he found himself drawn to you, Miss Whitmore. You share that same refusal to simply accept the boundaries others attempt to place upon you. Ilara glanced at Alistair, finding him watching her with an expression of quiet affection that made her heart skip. Perhaps that is precisely why we understand one another so well, she said softly. By the time the evening drew to its close, Ilara felt an unfamiliar warmth settling over her, not simply the relief of having passed Margaret's careful scrutiny, but a genuine sense of belonging that she had rarely experienced within circles of such wealth and standing. As Alistair walked her to her waiting carriage, the night air cool and quiet around them, he took her hand gently. You have won her over entirely, he said, his voice carrying genuine wonder. I have rarely seen my aunt speak so openly to anyone outside our immediate family. I merely answered her questions honestly, Ilara said, though pride warmed her chest at his words. That honesty is precisely what makes you so remarkable, Alistair said, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. I find myself falling further under your influence with each meeting, Ilara. I confess it frightens me somewhat, how quickly you have come to matter so deeply to me. It frightens me as well, Ilara admitted quietly. I have spent so long guarding my heart against disappointment that I hardly know how to proceed, now that hope has found its way past my defenses. Then perhaps, Alistair said softly, we might learn to navigate this uncertain territory together. He lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so simple, yet so tender, that Ilara felt her breath catch entirely. As she settled into her carriage moments later, watching him grow smaller in the distance as the vehicle pulled away, she allowed herself, for the first time without hesitation, to believe fully in the possibility of what was growing between them. But even as hope bloomed within her chest, a small, cautious voice reminded her that Lady Pembroke had not yet accepted defeat, and that whatever peace she had found this evening would soon be tested by forces far less forgiving than an old duchess's approval. The days following the dinner at Ravenscroft House passed in a rare stretch of quiet happiness for Ilara. She and Alistair exchanged letters almost daily, small notes filled with observations about their days, questions about each other's thoughts, gentle teasing that gradually stripped away the formal distance that had once defined their acquaintance. Twice more that week, they walked together through the gardens of Ravenscroft House, accompanied always by Beatrice or another suitable companion, but finding increasing ease in each other's presence regardless of who else stood nearby. It was during one such walk, beneath a canopy of blooming trees, that Alistair first spoke openly of his own past. You once asked me why Lady Pembroke's cruelty affected me so deeply that I felt compelled to intervene, he said, his eyes fixed on the winding path ahead, rather than on Ilara herself, as though the memory required some distance to share comfortably. I gave you a partial answer that night, but not the full truth. Ilara said nothing, sensing that he needed space to continue at his own pace. When I was younger, perhaps 19 or 20, I fell in love with a woman entirely unsuitable by society's standards, he continued. She was gentle and kind, and utterly without title or fortune. My father discovered our attachment and ended it swiftly, arranging for her family to relocate far from the city, ensuring I would have no opportunity to pursue the connection further. I am sorry, Ilara said softly, understanding immediately the weight this memory must carry. The worst part, Alistair continued, was not simply losing her, though that pain was significant enough. It was hearing, afterward, how society had spoken of her, dismissing her as unworthy, as a passing foolishness on my part, as though her feelings, her character, meant nothing at all, simply because she lacked the proper birth. I was young and powerless to stop it then. I have spent the years since determined never to remain silent in such circumstances again, should I find myself with the standing to intervene. Is that why you defended me so publicly? Elara asked. Not simply because of what you feel for me, but because of what happened to her? Alistair finally turned to meet her gaze, his gray eyes carrying an intensity she had not seen before. Initially, perhaps, old wounds played some part in my decision to intervene at the ball, but what I feel for you now, Elara, has grown into something entirely separate from that old pain. You are not a substitute for what I lost. You are your own person entirely, and it is you, specifically, who has come to matter so deeply to me. Elara felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the raw honesty of his admission. Thank you for trusting me with this. I trust you with a great deal more than old memories, Alistair said quietly, reaching for her hand. I trust you with my future, Elara, should you be willing to consider sharing it with me. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither had spoken aloud before, though both had clearly been feeling their truth for some time. Alara's heart pounded as she processed the implication behind his words. Alistair, she began, uncertain how to respond to such a significant declaration. I do not ask for an answer today, he said gently, sensing her uncertainty. I only wished you to know the depth of my feelings, before circumstances or society attempt to complicate matters further. They continued their walk in comfortable silence after that, though something had shifted irrevocably between them, a new understanding settling into place that neither felt the need to rush toward conclusion. That evening, however, as Elara returned home, she found her mother waiting anxiously in the parlor, an expression of concern etched across her features. Elara, Clara said, rising quickly as her daughter entered. I must speak with you about something troubling. What has happened? Elara asked, immediately alert to the tension in her mother's voice. Beatrice's mother called this afternoon while you were out, Clara explained. She mentioned rumors circulating through certain circles, rumors regarding your family's history, details we had hoped remained private. Elara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. What kind of details? Her mother hesitated before continuing. Rumors regarding your father's business failures. Specifically, claims that his difficulties were not simply the result of unfortunate circumstances, but of dishonest dealings that led certain business partners to lose significant investments. That is not true, Elara said firmly. Father's failures came from trusting men who later proved unreliable, not from any dishonesty on his part. I know that, Clara said gently. You know that. But rumors, once spoken aloud in the right circles, rarely require truth to spread and cause damage. Beatrice's mother believes these particular stories originated from someone specifically seeking to discredit our family. Elara's mind immediately jumped to the obvious suspect, Lady Pembroke. We cannot know for certain, Clara said, though her tone suggested she shared the same suspicion. But given recent events, it seems a reasonable assumption. Elara sat down heavily, the earlier joy of her walk with Alistair rapidly giving way to anxious dread. If these rumors continue to spread, they could ruin Father's remaining business prospects entirely. They could damage the family's reputation beyond repair. They could also damage your standing with the Duke, her mother added quietly. If society begins to believe your family engaged in genuine dishonesty, rather than simple misfortune, it may prove far more difficult for the Duke to continue his association with us, regardless of his personal feelings. The weight of this realization settled heavily over Elara. She had known, from the very beginning, that Lady Pembroke would not simply accept defeat gracefully, but she had not anticipated an attack so calculated, so precisely aimed at the very foundation of her family's already fragile standing. What should we do? Elara asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice for the first time in weeks. I do not know, Clara admitted. Your father has gone to speak with several of his former business associates this evening, hoping to understand the origin of these rumors, and perhaps counter them with truth. But rumors, once released into the world, prove remarkably difficult to contain. Elara spent a sleepless night considering the implications of what her mother had shared. Turning over every possible response in her mind, she thought of Alistair's earlier declaration. of his willingness to publicly defend her against Lady Pembroke's cruelty. But this new threat felt different, more insidious, striking not at her own character, but at her family's honor and livelihood. The following morning, a letter arrived from Alistair, unaware yet of the new complications unfolding. His words were warm, affectionate, entirely unsuspecting of the storm gathering around Ilara's family. She read it twice, torn between wanting to share her fears with him immediately and wanting to protect their still fragile connection from complications that felt, at least for now, entirely her own family's burden to bear. By midday, however, any hope of containing the situation privately dissolved entirely. Beatrice arrived at the Whitmore home, her expression grave. "Ilara," she said without preamble, "you must hear this from me before you hear it elsewhere. The rumors have grown far beyond simple whispers. Lady Pembroke has apparently spoken directly with several prominent families this morning, suggesting your father's business failures involve deliberate deception, and hinting that your family's current association with the Duke represents nothing more than a calculated attempt to secure financial rescue through marriage." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. "She is suggesting I am pursuing Alistair purely for financial gain." "Yes," Beatrice said grimly. "And given how quickly such stories tend to spread through society, I fear it will not be long before the Duke himself hears this version of events, regardless of how false it may be." The realization struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. Everything she and Alistair had built together over these past weeks, the honesty, the trust, the fragile hope of something genuine and lasting, now stood threatened by rumors designed specifically to poison that trust before it could fully take root. Whatever peace she had found in recent days had shattered entirely, replaced by the urgent, desperate need to protect not only her family's honor, but the fragile, precious connection she had come to treasure more than she had realized until this very moment of threatened loss. By the time evening fell, the rumors had spread far beyond Ilara's control. She sat in the parlor with her parents, the three of them exchanging worried glances as Nora delivered news of yet another visitor turned away at the door, this one a merchant who had previously done steady business with Edmund Whitmore, but now claimed sudden reservations about continuing their arrangement. "3 clients have withdrawn their orders today alone," Edmund said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and quiet despair. "Word has clearly spread faster than I anticipated." "We must find the source of these claims," Clara said, though her voice carried little conviction that such a task would prove easy. "If we can prove where these rumors originated, perhaps we can discredit them before further damage occurs." "I already know their source," Ilara said quietly. "Lady Pembroke made her intentions clear enough weeks ago. This is simply her method of ensuring I am removed from Alistair's life, one way or another." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and moments later Nora appeared, looking somewhat flustered. "Miss Ilara, the Duke has arrived. He insists on speaking with you immediately." Ilara's heart lurched painfully. She had known this conversation would come eventually, but she had hoped for more time to prepare. More time to consider how best to address the accusations now circulating about her family, and, by extension, her own motivations toward him. Alistair entered the parlor moments later, his expression unusually tense, though Ilara noted with some relief that his eyes, when they found hers, carried concern rather than accusation. "Ilara," he said, "I have heard troubling things today. I wish to hear the truth directly from you, rather than relying on second-hand accounts." "Please, sit," Ilara said, gesturing toward a chair, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Her parents rose quietly, offering the couple privacy, while remaining nearby in the adjoining room. Once they were alone, Alistair spoke again, his voice gentler now. "I have heard claims that your father's business failures involve deliberate dishonesty, rather than simple misfortune. I have also heard suggestions that your association with me stems from calculated intent rather than genuine feeling. I do not believe these claims, Ilara, but I felt it important that you understand exactly what is being said, so that we might address it together, rather than allowing it to fester unspoken between us." Relief flooded through Ilara at his words, though the underlying threat of the rumors still weighed heavily upon her. "Thank you for coming to me directly, rather than simply believing whatever version reached your ears first." "I could never believe such claims about you," Alistair said firmly. Not after everything I have witnessed of your character these past weeks. But I recognize that others may not share my certainty, and I wish to understand fully what we are facing, so that I might help however I can." Alara took a steadying breath before explaining everything she knew: her father's genuine misfortune at the hands of unreliable business partners, the sudden emergence of rumors suggesting deliberate dishonesty instead, and her strong suspicion that Lady Pembroke stood behind their calculated spread. "She wishes to separate us," Alara said finally, "by making it appear that my interest in you stems purely from financial desperation, rather than genuine affection." Alistair's expression darkened with quiet anger. "Lady Pembroke has proven remarkably persistent in her cruelty." "She has proven remarkably effective as well," Alara said, unable to keep the discouragement from her voice. "My father has already lost several clients today. If these rumors continue unchecked, I fear the damage to our family may prove irreparable, regardless of what happens between us." Alistair reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Then we shall address both concerns together. I intend to speak with my own associates, men whose word carries weight in matters of business and reputation, and ensure the truth of your father's circumstances becomes known. As for the suggestion that your affection for me stems from anything other than genuine feeling," he paused, his eyes searching hers with quiet intensity, "I intend to make my own feelings, and my belief in yours, known publicly and unmistakably." "What do you mean?" Alara asked, uncertain what such a declaration might entail. "There is a formal gathering at court next week," Alistair said. "A significant event, attended by nearly every family of consequence in the city, including Lady Pembroke herself. I intend to address these rumors directly and publicly, making clear both the falseness of the claims against your father and the sincerity of my own feelings toward you." Alara felt a flutter of both hope and apprehension at his words. "Alistair, such a public declaration carries significant risk for you as well. If society believes you are being manipulated by a scheming family, your own standing could suffer considerably." "I have already considered that risk," Alistair said steadily. "And I find I care far less about my own standing than I do about protecting your family's honor and our own future together. I have spent my entire life allowing calculation and caution to guide my choices, Alara. I find I no longer wish to live that way, not when something as precious as what we share hangs in the balance." Tears welled in Alara's eyes at the depth of his commitment. "I do not know how to thank you for such loyalty." "You need not thank me," Alistair said gently, lifting her hand to press a soft kiss against her knuckles. "I ask only that you trust me, and that you remain steady beside me, as we face whatever comes next together." "I trust you completely," Alara said, and found, as she spoke the words, that she meant them entirely. Over the following days, Alistair moved with quiet determination to address the crisis threatening Alara's family. He met privately with several prominent merchants and businessmen, men whose opinions carried significant weight in matters of trade and reputation, sharing evidence he had gathered regarding the true circumstances of Edmund Whitmore's earlier business failures. Evidence that clearly demonstrated the misfortune had stemmed from the dishonest actions of former partners, rather than any wrongdoing on Edmund's part. Slowly, cautiously, the tide began to shift. Several clients who had withdrawn their business returned, apologetic and somewhat embarrassed at having believed such claims without proper verification. Whispers of doubt began circulating regarding the true motivations behind the original rumors, with several sharp observers noting the suspicious timing of their emergence, so soon after Lady Pembroke's public humiliation at the concert. But Alara understood that true resolution would only come through the public declaration Alistair had promised at the upcoming court gathering. Whatever quiet progress had been made in private conversations, society at large still required a definitive, unmistakable statement before the matter could be considered truly resolved. As the day of the gathering approached, Alara found herself caught between hope and dread in equal measure. She trusted Alistair's intentions completely, believed fully in the sincerity of his affection and his determination to defend her family's honor. But she also understood the significant risk he was choosing to accept on her behalf, and the uncertain reception such a public declaration might receive from a society not always inclined toward mercy or understanding. Whatever happened at that gathering, Alara knew it would prove decisive, one way or another, in determining the future course of both her family's standing and her own fragile, precious connection with the man who had chosen, against every expectation of his position, to stand firmly and publicly beside her. The great hall at court glittered with candlelight, reflected endlessly in polished mirrors, the assembled crowd representing nearly every family of consequence within the city's aristocracy. Alara stood near the edge of the room, her hand resting lightly on Beatrice's arm for support, watching as guests continued to arrive in a steady stream of silk gowns and formal coats. She had chosen her attire carefully for this evening, an elegant but understated gown in deep green, nothing extravagant, nothing that might suggest she was attempting to prove herself through appearance rather than character. Tonight, she understood, would be decided by words and truth, not by fabric or jewels. "You seem remarkably composed," Beatrice observed quietly, studying her friend's steady expression. "I am terrified," Alara admitted softly, "but I have decided that fear will not prevent me from standing tall tonight, regardless of what unfolds." Across the room, she spotted Lady Pembroke holding court among a cluster of admiring women, her expression carrying the same smug confidence Alara remembered from the ball weeks earlier. Beside her stood Charlotte, though her daughter's expression seemed somewhat less certain than her mother's, as though sensing the tide might be preparing to shift against them. Alistair arrived shortly after, moving directly through the crowd toward Alara, his presence drawing the familiar wave of whispers and curious glances that had become an inevitable companion to their public appearances together. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, taking her hand. "As ready as I believe I can be," Alara replied. "And you? This will not be easy for you either." "I have never felt more certain of anything in my life," Alistair said firmly, his gray eyes steady and resolute. The formal proceedings of the evening continued for some time, various announcements and courtly formalities occupying the crowd's attention, until finally, a natural pause arrived in the evening's structured events, a moment when guests mingled freely, before the final formal address of the night. It was during this interval that Alistair chose to act. He led Alara toward the center of the hall, positioning them where the gathered crowd could not help but notice their presence, and raised his voice with the calm, commanding authority that came naturally to a man of his position. "Friends," he began, and the surrounding conversations gradually quieted as more and more guests turned their attention toward him. "I find myself compelled to address certain matters that have occupied considerable discussion within our circles these past days." The hall fell almost entirely silent now, every eye fixed upon the Duke and the young woman standing beside him. Alara felt her heart pounding fiercely, though she forced herself to maintain steady composure, meeting the curious stares directed her way without flinching. "Rumors have circulated recently," Alistair continued, "suggesting that Miss Alara Whitmore's family has engaged in dishonest business practices, and further suggesting that her association with me stems from calculated financial motivation, rather than genuine feeling. I stand before you tonight to address both claims directly and unequivocally." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Alara noticed Lady Pembroke's expression shifting from smug confidence to something considerably more guarded. "Regarding the claims against Edmund Whitmore's business dealings," Alistair continued, "I have personally reviewed evidence gathered from several respected merchants within this city, evidence that clearly demonstrates his earlier financial difficulties stemmed entirely from the dishonest actions of former business partners, not from any wrongdoing on his own part. Several of these merchants stand here tonight, and I invite them to confirm this truth directly, should any among you require further verification." Several figures near the back of the crowd stepped forward slightly, nodding in confirmation, their presence lending immediate credibility to Alistair's words. Alara felt a wave of relief wash over her, watching as doubt began visibly spreading through the crowd regarding the original rumors. "As for the suggestion that Miss Whitmore's affection toward me stems from calculated motivation rather than genuine feeling," Alistair continued, his voice softening slightly, as he turned to look directly at Alara, "I would ask any among you who has witnessed her character firsthand to consider whether such calculation seems consistent with what you have observed. I have watched this woman endure public humiliation with quiet dignity. I have watched her defend her family's honor with unwavering conviction. I have watched her extend kindness and honesty in every interaction I have witnessed, regardless of the audience or the stakes involved." He paused, and the silence in the hall grew almost unbearably thick with anticipation. "I love her," Alistair said simply, the words carrying clearly through the quiet hall. "Not for any advantage her family's circumstances might provide me, for they provide none. Not for any strategic alliance her connections might offer, for she holds none of consequence within our society's usual calculations. I love her for her honesty, her courage, and her steadfast refusal to allow cruelty or circumstance to diminish her true worth. If anyone here believes such feelings are somehow calculated or false, I would ask them to reconsider, for I have never spoken words with greater sincerity in my entire life." Alara felt tears welling in her eyes as she listened, overwhelmed by the public sincerity of his declaration, by the courage it required for a man of his position to speak so openly and vulnerably before an audience inclined toward judgment and gossip. The silence that followed his words stretched for several long moments before finally breaking into a murmur of surprised, impressed conversation, several guests nodding in evident approval at the Duke's forthright honesty. Near the back of the group that had gathered to confirm the truth of Edmund Whitmore's business dealings, Alara noticed several prominent families exchanging approving glances, clearly moved by the sincerity of Alistair's declaration. Lady Pembroke, meanwhile, stood frozen near the edge of the crowd, her earlier confidence entirely dismantled, her expression caught somewhere between fury and humiliation, as she realized the extent to which her scheme had failed publicly and definitively. "Lady Pembroke," Alistair said, turning his attention directly toward her now, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. "I believe you owe Miss Whitmore and her family a sincere apology, given the damage your rumors have caused to their reputation and livelihood, based on claims that have now been thoroughly disproven before this entire gathering." For a long, tense moment, Lady Pembroke said nothing, her jaw tight with barely contained anger and embarrassment. Finally, recognizing that the crowd's sympathy had shifted entirely against her, she offered a stiff, clearly reluctant nod. "I may have been mistaken in my earlier assessments," she said, her voice tight with poorly concealed resentment. "I apologize for any distress caused by rumors that have proven unfounded." It was hardly a gracious apology, but Alara understood. It represented as much acknowledgement as Lady Pembroke's pride would allow, and given the circumstances, she found she required nothing further. As the crowd's attention gradually shifted toward other conversations, buzzing with excitement over what they had just witnessed, Alistair turned back to Alara, his expression softening from the firm resolve he had shown moments earlier into something considerably more tender. "I hope," he said quietly, "that I have not overstepped in declaring my feelings so publicly, without first discussing such a declaration with you privately. You have done nothing but defend me with more courage than I could have hoped for," Alara said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Alistair, for everything." "I meant every word," he said softly, reaching for her hand. "I love you, Alara. Regardless of circumstance, regardless of what society believes it understands about worth and standing, I love you for exactly who you are." "And I love you," Alara replied, the words emerging easily now, freed finally from the careful caution she had maintained for so long. "I have loved you, I believe, since that very first dance, though I hardly dared admit it, even to myself." Around them, the formal gathering continued, guests resuming their conversations, the earlier drama gradually settling into simply another remarkable story, to be shared and retold throughout the city in the coming days. But for Alara and Alistair, standing together at the center of that grand hall, nothing else in the room seemed to matter, beyond the quiet, steady certainty they had finally found in each other. 3 months passed, following the gathering at court, and the change in Alara's circumstances proved as remarkable as it was gradual. Her father's business, once threatened by baseless rumors, had recovered entirely, bolstered further by several new clients who sought him out specifically after hearing of his connection to the now celebrated Duke of Ravenscroft. Edmund Whitmore, for the first time in years, no longer wore the weary, worried expression that had become so familiar during their family's difficult seasons. Alara herself had grown accustomed, slowly, to the constant attention that came with being publicly courted by one of the city's most eligible and respected dukes. Where once she had shrunk from notice, hoping only to remain unseen and unremarked upon, she now found herself greeting curious glances and whispered conversations with quiet confidence, understanding fully now that her worth had never depended on society's approval, regardless of how loudly some had once insisted otherwise. Lady Pembroke, meanwhile, had retreated considerably from the social prominence she once commanded. Her scheme against the Whitmore family, thoroughly exposed and publicly disproven, had cost her significant standing among the very circles she had once dominated so effortlessly. Charlotte, her daughter, had quietly distanced herself from her mother's more calculating tendencies, occasionally even exchanging polite, genuine conversation with Alara at gatherings they both attended, the earlier rivalry between them having faded into something closer to cautious mutual respect. It was on a warm afternoon in early autumn that Alistair arranged for Alara to join him once more in the gardens of Ravenscroft House, the same gardens where their connection had first begun to deepen so many months before. The roses that had bloomed so vibrantly during their earlier meeting had given way to the golden hues of the changing season, but the beauty of the space remained undiminished. "You seem thoughtful today," Alara observed as they walked together along the familiar stone path, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. "I have been considering something important," Alistair replied, a note of nervousness entering his usually steady voice. "Something I have wished to ask you for some time now, though I confess, I have waited to ensure the timing felt appropriate." Alara felt her heart quicken with anticipation as they reached the same small fountain where they had first shared tea together, so many months earlier. Alistair stopped, turning to face her fully, his gray eyes carrying an intensity and warmth that had become so achingly familiar to her over the course of their courtship. "Alara," he said, reaching for both her hands, "from the moment I first saw you standing quietly beside that window, refusing to let Lady Pembroke's cruelty diminish your composure, I knew there was something remarkable about you, something the rest of the room had failed entirely to recognize. In the months since, you have proven yourself to be everything I had hoped and more. Kind, honest, courageous, and steady in ways I have rarely encountered in anyone, regardless of their station." He knelt then, and Alara felt tears already gathering in her eyes, understanding fully what was about to unfold. "I do not offer you a title, or wealth, or standing as the true measure of what I wish to give you," Alistair continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I offer you my honesty, my loyalty, and my complete devotion, for as long as we both shall live. Alara Whitmore, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Alara could not speak, overwhelmed entirely by the depth of emotion swelling within her chest. She thought of that first humiliating night at the ball, of Lady Pembroke's cruel dismissal, of every moment since when she had wondered whether she truly belonged in the world Alistair inhabited. And she understood, finally and completely, that none of those doubts mattered any longer, not when faced with a love as genuine and steadfast as the one kneeling before her now. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with happiness. "Yes, Alistair, I will marry you." He rose immediately, sweeping her into an embrace that lifted her feet briefly from the ground, both of them laughing, with the pure, unrestrained joy of the moment. When he finally set her down, he kissed her gently, a tender promise of everything still ahead of them. News of their engagement spread through the city with even greater speed than the earlier rumors and scandals that had once threatened to tear them apart. But this time, the whispers carried genuine warmth and admiration rather than cruelty or suspicion. The story of how the Duke of Ravenscroft had walked across a crowded ballroom to defend a quietly dismissed young woman, and how their connection had weathered scandal and rumor to blossom into genuine love, became one of the most celebrated tales the city had witnessed in years. Duchess Margaret, upon hearing the news, embraced Alara warmly, tears of genuine happiness gathering in her eyes. "I could not have hoped for a more fitting match for my nephew," she said. "You have brought a warmth and honesty into this family that I feared had been lost entirely." Even Beatrice, who had stood beside Alara through every difficult moment of the preceding months, could hardly contain her joy at the news. "I always believed in this outcome," she said, embracing her closest friend tightly. "From that very first dance, I knew there was something extraordinary unfolding between the two of you." The wedding, when it finally arrived some months later, proved a celebration unlike any the city had witnessed in recent memory. Guests from every level of society gathered to witness the union, drawn not simply by curiosity regarding the Duke's unconventional choice of bride, but by genuine admiration for the love story that had unfolded so publicly, and so courageously, over the preceding year. As Alara stood at the altar, dressed in a gown of soft ivory silk, watching Alistair approach with unwavering devotion shining clearly in his eyes, she thought back to that humiliating night at the ball, when Lady Pembroke had dismissed her so cruelly, before an entire room of judgmental onlookers. She thought of how completely her life had transformed since that painful moment, how the very insult meant to diminish her had instead marked the beginning of the greatest happiness she had ever known. When Alistair reached her at the altar and took her hands in his own, he leaned close enough to whisper words meant only for her ears. "You were never simply decorative," he said softly, echoing the cruel words that had once threatened to define her. "You have always been the truest treasure I have ever discovered." Alara smiled through happy tears, understanding fully now that every difficult moment of her past had led her, unerringly, to this precious, unshakable happiness. Whatever challenges still lay ahead in their shared future, she faced them now, not as an overlooked ornament standing quietly at the edges of society's grand halls, but as a woman, fully seen, fully valued, and fully loved by the man standing beside her. As they exchanged their final vows before the gathered crowd, sealing their union with quiet, joyful certainty, Alara felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she had truly found the place where she belonged, not because society had finally granted her permission to belong, but because she had proven, through every trial and triumph, that her worth had never depended on anyone's permission at all.